Sometimes when you need to have a difficult conversation, the direct path isn't always the most strategic for you. Now, conventional wisdom and best practices suggest that if you need to have a difficult conversation, you just have to muster up the courage and then go and do that. However, the challenge is quite often that doesn't take into account emotional regulation, right? The idea that sometimes our emotions can kick in and prevent us from actually applying what we think that we should do in the heat of the moment. And then some people have pent up baggage from previous experiences where they may have tried this approach and then just kept shut down and shut down and shut down. So this video is to share with you a different strategy, an alternative strategy that can perhaps help you if you feel like the direct path isn't for you. Now, recently I was having a conversation with a leader in an organization, and they were saying that they have to have a difficult conversation with their boss, but they work in a heavily male-oriented or male-dominated environment field. And in the past, their experience has been that because they're a woman, it impacts their ability to have that difficult conversation. It impacts how people receive them or have received that individual. And this has clouded her ability or made it difficult for her to have these difficult conversations. And just the thought of it was giving her a lot of anxiety and nervousness. And she actually approached me and said, hey, what are the resources? What are the mentors? What are the coaches available to help me kind of walk through this? And then I brought up the idea that maybe sometimes you don't need to have that direct path. Based on my experience, you can take an alternative path. And that alternative path is to send an email. You send an email. And there's a few benefits behind this, because the first one is based on the idea that imagine that you're walking down the hallway and then your boss or someone pulls you into their office and they bring up some difficult news or difficult information or start a difficult conversation with you. Are you going to be super open and receptive at that point? Or are you going to be a little bit more defensive? And chances are, most people, emotions kind of kick in, they can become defensive. And then if they become defensive, it becomes difficult to have a logical and clear conversation. If one person becomes defensive, they become a little bit more emotional. Maybe you become a little bit emotional. Both parties become emotional, and it becomes very difficult to have a productive conversation, and the whole conversation could be derailed. That's one thing to think about. The second thing is that you may think that just yourself may have emotional difficulties conveying the message. Your best laid plans fall out the window when you start breathing heavy. You start feeling that the other person's challenging or not listening. And you don't get to actually say and convey any of the information that you had initially wanted to. It gets lost. And so writing it down and sending it allows you to write out your thoughts clearly in a structured manner. Edit over and over and over again, so it is exactly what you want to send. And then the receiver gets to read it and absorb it, perhaps when a time then they're less emotionally aroused, so to speak. And that lays the foundation for a potential conversation thereafter. The individual could email a response to you, or you could perhaps follow it up with an actual conversation. And at the very least, you know that the individual has a high likelihood of knowing what you truly wanted to convey. And that could be essentially the bridge to having a difficult conversation that you feel needs to be had. This is a small example of where emotional intelligence, developing your emotional intelligence, is so important. It's the idea of recognizing how your emotions and the other person's emotions can impact your ability to communicate, to get your messages across. The ultimate goal of a difficult conversation with an individual is simply to get to a resolution, right? You want to have it resolved. But the challenge is, in order to get it resolved, certain information needs to be conveyed. And emotion, if you know emotions are going to prevent that from happening, well, you have to find an alternative route to increase the likelihood that that information gets transferred, and so that a resolution could potentially be made. And so that's where you look at the different mediums of communication. And in this situation, an email is that alternative medium of communication, which can then potentially lead to another email or a conversation that's done face-to-face. So if you found this tip useful, I have more on my website at www.johngodoy.com, where I have workshops, speaking engagements, and other material that can help you become a much more effective professional and a much more effective leader.